Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are cracking open a 2,000-year-old letter from the book of Revelation. It's a message that some argue actually predicted a huge turning point in the history of the Christian church.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll frame these letters as a kind of ancient report card. Then, we're going to visit the unique city of Pergamus. After that, we'll unpack a pretty sinister strategy called the doctrine of Balaam, see how that points to this married church era, and finally, we'll look at the incredible promise made to those who overcome.
I mean, just think about that for a second. A direct, no-nonsense evaluation of what you're doing right and where you're seriously dropping the ball. Well, according to our source material, that is exactly what these 7 letters in Revelation were for 7 real historical churches back in the 1st century. So we're zeroing in on the 3rd of these letters, a message sent to a church in a city that was facing a really intense and unique spiritual battle. Yeah, and it's so important to get this. These were not just symbolic fairy tales. The source makes it clear these were direct messages to actual congregations. Each one had specific praise for the good stuff, but also some really pointed concerns about problems they had to fix. It's an amazing window into the struggles of the early believers. Okay, so before we can really dig into the report card itself, we have to understand who was receiving it. And the city of Pergamus, well, it wasn't just some random town on the map. It had a very powerful identity. You see, while its neighbors like Ephesus and Smyrna were big-time political and commercial centers, Pergamus was the religious capital of the region. It had this gigantic altar to Zeus. It was home to the famous healing cult of the serpent god Esculapius. And crucially, it was a main hub for the mandatory worship of the Roman emperor. It was basically a spiritual pressure cooker of paganism. Now, here's where the history gets really wild. Our source lays out this direct line of succession. After ancient Babylon fell, its powerful priesthood, the keepers of all its mystery religions, they packed up and moved their headquarters to Pergamus. That whole system would later move on to Rome. This incredible backstory is why the letter uses this shocking phrase to describe Pergamus, the place where Satan's seat is. So, with that intense spiritual environment as the backdrop, let's finally look at the actual report card for the church trying to survive there. What were they getting right, and where were they failing? The message starts with praise, which is pretty amazing. Even in a place literally called Satan's seat, this church was holding on tight to their faith. But then comes the warning, the big red flag. They were tolerating something called the doctrine of Balaam. And this was a dangerous compromise that was rotting the church from the inside out. So what on earth is this doctrine? Well, the source points back to an Old Testament story. You see, an enemy king hired a prophet named Balaam to curse Israel, but it didn't work. So Balaam came up with a new plan, a plan B. He told the king, look, don't attack them from the outside, corrupt them from the inside, get them to intermarry and worship idols, and they'll destroy themselves. It is the ultimate strategy of spiritual compromise. In that strategy, that doctrine of Balaam is the master key that unlocks the whole next level of this letter. This is where the message makes this incredible jump, from being a historical warning to a specific church, to what our source says is a prophetic forecast of an entire era of church history. So the argument is that you can read these letters on 4 different levels. There's the local message for that specific church. There's an admonitory or general warning for any church anywhere. There's a personal checkup for any individual. And then there's the prophetic level. And this 4th layer, some say, lays out a startlingly accurate history of the church before it even happened. Now, in this prophetic view, Pergamus represents a very specific time in church history. And get this, the name Pergamus itself is a huge clue. It can be translated as mixed marriage, pointing to a future time when the church would become married to the world and to the state. This whole marriage thing didn't just happen overnight. It was a slow burn. It really kicked off around 312 AD with Emperor Constantine's conversion. Then, in 325, the Edict of Toleration made Christianity legal, which after centuries of persecution must have felt like a huge win. But by 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius took that final step and made Christianity the official, mandatory state religion of the entire Roman Empire. And that quote just nails it, doesn't it? The core of this interpretation is that the church, which was once this outsider movement, was now completely tangled up with worldly power, money, and politics. The marriage was complete. But this marriage, it came with some pretty severe consequences.
Pagan temples were just slapped with a new coat of paint and called churches. Heathen festivals got new Christian names. Forced conversions flooded the churches with people who weren't genuine believers. And pretty soon, the state-sponsored church just absorbed all sorts of pagan traditions. You know, what centuries of persecution couldn't achieve, worldly power and acceptance did, through compromise.
But even in this really difficult period of widespread compromise, the letter doesn't end on a downer. It closes with a very personal, very intimate promise of a reward for the people who resist. The letter promises two deeply symbolic rewards to the overcomer. That's the person who refuses to compromise. First, hidden manna. Our source connects this to Jesus as the true bread of life, the real spiritual food, not the junk food offered at pagan temples. Second, a white stone with a new name. Now, in the ancient world, a white stone often meant you were acquitted in a trial. Here, it stands for personal forgiveness and a brand new, intimate identity that's known only between you and God.
And all of this leaves us with one final, challenging thought from this ancient letter. If the marriage of church and state was the great compromise of that era, trading spiritual purity for worldly power and acceptance, what might that doctrine of Balaam, that strategy of compromise, look like in our world today?